with a whole lot of truth. Remedy Revolution is here for you. Ooh. And now here's your host, Erin Page.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Remedy Revolution. My name is Erin, and today's guest is someone who I've been following for a very long time. I say this every time, but I truly am really very excited to have him here today. He is the attorney for many of the cases that you've seen come through the pipeline when it comes to vaccine litigation, and I'm very pleased to announce Erin Siri here on the podcast today.
It's great to be here.
So tell us a little bit about what inspired you to join all of this anti-vaccine, for lack of a better term at the moment, of craziness. I know there was so many people who kind of jumped in right around 2016 when Vaxxed came out. I know that your introduction to Dell was pretty integral to your journey, but tell us a little bit about you and why you decided to go into vaccine litigation.
I think the right to decide whether you want to get a vaccine is a fundamental individual and civil right. So, they say take vaccines out of politics, and I completely agree. You shouldn't make vaccines political, and the way you do that is you end mandates. So, I think it should just be a completely medical question, just like so many drugs are. You go in, you meet your doctor, you make a decision, you leave, and that's that. But here they inject the law, they inject a coercion, and so they've made it a legal issue, and hence the reason that I do the work that I do around these products in large part, as well as the injuries that they cause. Um, so um, uh, yeah, that is one of the impetuses, and the other one is, if you really think about any minority group. Just imagine a racial group or an ethnic group or a religious group. And then imagine I told you you should throw them out of school, take them out of their jobs, that they are selfish, they're bad people. Don't treat them when they come to the hot, you'd be like, wow, you'd be horrified. But that's how they treat folks who make the decision not to receive these products, often not to receive more of these products, typically for their kids, after their kids already had a bad reaction. So, it's there's any they are a group that needs protection. In fact, probably more than most groups out there, because it's rare you can turn on the TV and listen to a mainstream, so to speak, nightly news anchor talk about those who don't vaccinate the way they would talk about any other group in this country.
Yeah, I can certainly attest to that as someone who is now a refugee from the state of California. So I absolutely understand, personally, the kinds of ad hominem attacks that really hit hard for so many parents that are just trying to do the best by their children and for their children and get relentlessly pursued by people who really have no vested interest in what they do within their own home.
'Cause you
So
have to understand that their vaccine doesn't work unless you get one.
right, exactly. So I want to get into that. So you have authored this book called Vaccines Amen, which I think is brilliant, a brilliant title because for many, many years I have talked about the religiosity of vaccines and how, there is a certain, let's say, a certain decisive language that people utilize when they're talking about vaccines. Primarily, it's the mantra of safe and effective. So, kind of continuing with your allegory, I would love to kind of break down that mantra of safe and effective. And maybe we could start with effectiveness first. I do think wrapped up in that effectiveness argument is this idea of necessity, right? So we presume, if you're coming from the other end of the argument, a necessity for a vaccine, and then we look at the efficacy. So maybe you could talk about both of those and how they play a role.
You mean
The
I could see the argument that they stop transmission to make the claim that they should be mandated.
Right. And additionally, the effectiveness argument, because that mantra is consistently safe and effective, safe and effective, safe and
Yeah.
effective, right? So when we talk about efficacy, what are some of the things, the holes that you've been able to poke into that particular argument?
Sure. Well, first of all, starting with the argument about transmission, because it goes to the heart of why they say everybody must partake. Most vaccines don't stop transmission. It's not it's not controversial in the scientific literature. It might be controversial in the evening news, but most vaccines just don't because they don't generate the type of immunity that would prevent transmission. They might reduce symptoms like pertussis vaccine, so it lessens the symptoms, but it doesn't create any kind of immunity that prevents transmission, particularly with like pertussis, for example. It replicates on your mucosal surfaces, in your nasopharynx, and the vaccine doesn't create any mucosal immunity. So it might, prevent you from getting some symptoms, but it doesn't prevent the bacteria from replicating your nasopharynx. And in fact, because you're less likely to have symptoms, you're less likely to know you have it, and that you're harboring the bacterium, and so you're more likely to kiss your grandkid or your kid or and go, hang out. So it's deeply ironic because, for some vaccines, actually, it's those who are vaccinated that, under their logic, is more likely to spread the underlying pathogen. So that's first of all, and that's true of most of the vaccines, including most of them required for school. The notable exceptions are MMR and chickenpox. So measles vaccine, chickenpox vaccine, those can prevent transmission. But then when you actually look at the efficacy, even for products like that, you still have to balance it against the risks of the products, the safety component of it, as well as the externalities. What impact is that going to have on the ecology of the underlying pathogen? And how will that affect public health overall? They often don't do that. And that is an important components of the efficacy piece of it. I'll just give one final example, like COVID-19 vaccine. They'll hone in on something that they deem efficacious, and they'll just stick to that. So, for example, in the COVID-19 clinical trial for Pfizer, when they announced it's 95% effective, right? What was that based on? Well, it was based on finding about 8 people in the vaccine group who tested positive for COVID, who had kind of sniffles typically, versus about 160 something in the placebo group who tested positive for sniffles, for tested positive for COVID-19 vaccine, who had sniffles. And they said, oh, 95% effective. Here's the thing. After we sued the FDA and got all the underlying clinical trial documents, what we found is there were actually thousands of people who had symptoms, but they were part of that calculation with regards to efficacy. Why? It's a really good question. Still not clear to me, right? Because that does obviously is inject bias into that determination. Maybe there were far more people who would have tested positive for COVID-19 with sniffles in the vaccinated group had you tested them all, right? And you included them in that calculation. So when it came to that 95% number efficacy, the FDA should have really looked under the hood and looked very carefully at those numbers, but they don't. On the other side of it, when you think of the most important outcome you're trying to prevent with these products is death, there were actually more deaths in the vaccinated group than the placebo group. There were 21 deaths amongst those getting Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine in its trial versus 17 deaths in the placebo group. So more deaths. Now, in that instance, you would think you would just do a statistical comparison, but no, the FDA instead let Pfizer explain every death away as unrelated to the placebo or the vaccine. So, when you talk about efficacy, there's there's the on the one hand, there's whether it prevents transmission, and then there's also how much of an impact does it actually have in reducing deaths and hospitalizations from the underlying pathogen. And those are, they vary widely by different vaccines.
Yeah, absolutely. For example, some vaccines are considered efficacious if they induce antibody production. But does that antibody production actually prevent them from spreading or getting that particular disease. And in some cases, that's not the truth. So ultimately, I think there's so much more to this conversation. And you've kind of brought up a point here that I really want to make sure and reiterate. And that's this idea of scientific integrity when it comes to some of these numbers that are coming out. So, um, speak a little bit to some of the studies that are coming out and what they conclude versus what the data actually states.
Sure. I mean, when it comes to vaccine-related literature, you've got to look really, really carefully. First of all, there's two major issues with most of the vaccine literature. First is that there's no real moneyed interest to see if these products are safe. Unlike with most products where you can't hold the company accountable for the, deaths and the injuries on the basis they could have made the product safer, vaccines are the only product in America since 1960 that have a permanent immunity to those claims. So they can basically kill or seriously injure you or your kid with impunity. And you can't say, hey, had you made it safer, my kid wouldn't be dead. My kid wouldn't be seriously injured. Only product like that. And so without that financial incentive, because money drives science, for better or worse, you need to have somebody fund the studies. You have to somebody fund the clinical trial. And there's nobody who's got a financial interest to really assess safety, which you don't really have. What you end up with is a form of selection bias, where the only things that actually get funded or published are studies that affirm what it is those funding it want to find. So on the obviously industry side, they're not going to put out a study that shows that their products cause harm. Why would they do that? And on the government side, the CDC unfortunately has a policy, right, that vaccines are safe and effective. And they will only publish things that align with their policy in their publication, the MMWR. That's literally, it's on their website. You can read it. And I explained it in my book. So you've got the government agencies that are supposed to be overlooking safety. Not that the government makes products safer. They don't. It's economic self-interest of companies that drive safety. Um, uh, but they're not doing that work. And so you end up with selection bias. So that's first of all. Second, for the limited amount of studies and science that does exist, and it is quite limited. I mean, when somebody calls our firm about a vaccine injury, we want good literature because we have to prove the vaccine caused the injury. And so, could tell you it's mostly vacuous, but some of the limited studies that are available, often the underlying data is not available, which is just a basic violation of scientific integrity, right? They'll do them often in these, closed box systems like the vaccine safety data link, and they won't let you get access to the underlying data, even though it's de-identified. So you can replicate the study, you could see if it's reliable, you could see it's accurate. So selection bias and lack of transparency and very limited amount of studies anyway. So that's a quick encapsulation of the problem.
And tell us a little bit about how the 1986 Act, as is kind of colloquially called, has impacted industry when it comes to vaccine manufacturers.
Oh, it's had an incredible impact. So leading up to 1986, there were only three routine vaccines, DTP, MMR, and OPV. That's it. A child following the entire schedule in 1980, leading up to 1986, would have gotten 7 injections and only 3 injections in the first year of life. That was it. That was the CDC schedule, what I just said to you. But those products, as few as they were causing so much harm and injury that the manufacturers all stopped making them or went out of business. So we were down from like 6 pertussis companies, manufacturers to one, 6 pertussis vaccine manufacturers down to one, about 6 measles down to one, 3 polio down to one. And, a lot of industries face this crossroad. It happens. If you're home, the product you're using that you're selling for people to use in their houses are causing cancer, you make a product that doesn't cause cancer. If you've got gas tanks that are exploding in cars, you make a better car. But in this instance, Congress did something completely unprecedented. Instead of forcing this industry to make better, safer products, it said, you know what? We're just going to make it so nobody could sue you for their dead babies and for the serious injury you're causing them or their children. We're just going to make it so they can't sue you. And then And that is what the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986, the 1986 Act is. It essentially shielded those companies from being able to be sued for those injuries. And not only, and this is what I call the original sin in my book, not only for the three vaccines existing back then, but for any routine childhood vaccine brought to market thereafter. And that was the genesis of the explosion in the childhood schedule, where we went from 3 injections in the first year of life to 25 routine injections in the first year of life, including in utero, up until actually yesterday. We're now gone from 25 and we're down to about 18 now. So we're still very far from three, but we're getting closer. And overall, from 50 something to about half that number now after yesterday's announcement. So still quite a lot of increase. And the real problem with that is that some might look at that and say, well, that's progress. Um, but here's the issue. Every single one of those vaccines, except for one, which existed from before 86, every single one of those vaccines was clinical trialed by a company, by a pharma company, because that's who conducts clinical trial, the company that wants to sell it later, knowing that they would not be liable for the deaths and injuries caused by that product on the basis they could have made it safer. And what does that do to how do they conduct that trial? It removes the economic self-interest for them to conduct the trial to actually assess safety, to conduct a long-term placebo-controlled trial, which is what they do for drug products. Why? Because they want to make sure that they're going to lose money. It's not because of the FDA. Government's useless. It's nothing to do with the government. It has to do with the fact, in terms of assuring product safety, right? In the big picture, it has to do with economic self-interest. That's what drives product safety. So they have it for drugs, hence often multi-year placebo-controlled trial, but they don't have it for vaccines. And so that immunity has had a really, really a massive impact in the number of vaccines, the clinical trials relied upon to license them, and the ability to hold them accountable for the harms and injuries that they've caused.
Okay, so I want to go back to what you just stated about the CDC rolling back the recommended schedule just yesterday as we're recording this. So tell me a little bit about the implications that that may have down the road. Are there less protections for the pharmaceutical industry at this point?
So 5 of the vaccines were moved out of the routine category into something called shared clinical decision making. What that should do is remove the immunity for those products because the immunity under the 1986 Act is explicitly related to routine recommended vaccines. So as long as these are not routinely recommended vaccines, they should not have immunity under the 1986 Act. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to see them flying off the market tomorrow, or they're going to be, held accountable in 5 minutes. Drug products that cause serious harm don't go off the market immediately. Look at, I could give an endless array of examples, but what often happens is plaintiffs start accumulating cases. The pharma company knows that's happening. They often start putting money aside. And then, 5, 7, 10 years down the road, there's often a settlement essentially where they pay out the claims. But at that point, they've made 50 billion, they pay out 15 billion. The company's very happy. The folks who've been injured are not so happy. But, that's often how it goes. And so here, just because those 5 vaccines are no longer shielded or should not be shielded, it will take time for that to filter through the normal market forces to conform conduct, but it will happen in times, and that's the good news, as long as another administration doesn't reverse what's been done.
Yeah, well, that's the the $80 million question at this point, right? Okay, so the book is called Vaccines, Amen. Before we get into safety, I want to talk about that this belief system, right? Because it's the only product that I know of that, in response to, me saying I'm not vaccinating or I'm not getting the COVID vaccine, people will say, "Oh, I believe in vaccines." And that's always been so strange to me. I don't understand why people say that. And I think it really gives credence credence to your title, Vaccines Amen. So tell me a little bit about, the basis for why you began writing this book. And of course, the way that it's framed so beautifully is this structure, this religious structure.
Yeah. Well, just on the on people saying they believe in vaccines, I'll even hear people say to me when I tell them about something comes up about somebody being injured by a vaccine, and the response is, "Well, I believe in vaccines." Can you imagine? They say, "Well, I was injured by Ozempic." Well, I believe in Ozempic. It's such a heartless, such a cruel response to you just said there's this kid who seriously injured or died from a vaccine, and the reaction isn't, oh, that's terrible. That's so sad. It is, I believe in vaccines. They don't want to let and because it goes to the heart of this idea of it being a belief system. It is in many ways kind of like a religion, except in a typical religion, you know it's a religion. You know you're taking a leap of faith. Where do we go when we die? The answer to the unanswerables, right? And so, you know you're engaged in a belief system. These folks often don't realize they're in a belief system. They think their views are science-based, fact-based, data-driven. And that's what makes this religion so perverted, is that it's their views are typically not based on data, science, reality. They're based on this belief system that they think is data-driven. And so I wrote this book because over the last 10 years, when I first started doing work around vaccines, I didn't know anything about almost anything about vaccines. I probably just had the same generalized views that everybody else had. Oh, yeah, safe, effective, everybody's got to get them, saved humanity, everybody would die without them, they're perfectly safe, right? And then as I started doing this work and um, deposing the world's leading vaccinologists, holding them to those claims, suing federal health and state health agencies, demanding the proof to these claims, and then looking at the proof that the claims aren't true, I started, realizing that there is what they tell you, what public health officials tell you. There's what the evidence shows, and that is that bridge, that divide is where there's this belief system, and the most uh, troubling aspect of this belief system is that even when I confront the vaccinologists, the pediatricians, and the infectious disease doctors, and the immunologists, and the public health officials with the actual data, with the primary sources, say, hey, wait a second. Here is the actual clinical trial report. Look at it. Here is the actual mechanistic data, evidence. Here is actually what the findings are with whether or not it causes mucosal immunity and can prevent transmission, right? They'll still often react with, but no, like they still want to hold on to their beliefs despite the data. It is the most incredible religion I've ever seen because it defies any reason. It often will defy the data. So what I did is I wrote the book to help, because most folks don't view vaccines that way. I don't think most folks are susceptible to reason, to knowledge, to if they see the proof, they'll change their mind. Most people, I think, are like that. The vaccine amen crowd, no, that's a small group of folks, I talk about in my book. But for most folks, they are. And when people start seeing these products as products, because that's what they are, okay? They're not items of worship. They weren't given to Moses at Sinai. They're just products made by corporates for profit, like every other product you encounter every day, okay? um, when people start seeing them like products again, that is when we'll be able to turn the corner on this issue. When you change cultural cognition, you get different outcomes in the court system, you get different outcomes in the legislative houses. Gay marriage, for example, whatever one might think about it, was never going to be affirmed by the U.S. Supreme Court as a constitutional right, as Supreme Court has now done, right, in the 1800s or in 1910 or 1920 or 1930. It's never going to happen. Why? Did the Constitution change? No. Cultural cognition changed around the issue. And the same thing is what I'm hoping to accomplish with the book, which is that when you read the book, and I've tried to make the book fun and interesting, and go through the lawsuits and the evidence in a discovery kind of process. Um, uh, if a critical mass in America starts thinking about these products as products, not as and not stops believing in them and starts thinking about them, we can have that change in the court system. We can have that change in the legislative houses and even in the executive branches. So the goal of the book is not to make you think vaccines are good or bad. Those are religious terms, or to be anti or pro, or it's just to think that I'm not anti or pro this chair I'm sitting on. I don't think it's good or bad. It's just a chair. It's got chemicals in it, give me cancer. I'd say, oh, that's not good. If it's, if a leg breaks on it, the point is that it's a chair, it's a product, and I'll judge it as such. And once people, the hope is if they read the book, they'll start seeing the product that way, whether they continue to take them or don't take them, but at least do so from a place of knowledge. Before you buy a car for your kid, you probably look at the crash test. This is an opportunity to do that for vaccines.
Yeah, I think that's amazing and it's so brilliantly put because there are these vaccinologists who are placed on pedestals, people that you have deposed, like Dr. Stanley Plotkin, Dr. Catherine Edwards. And I have watched many hours. I won't say I've watched all of the hours because it's extensive, but many hours of those depositions. And um, I think it was shocking, even to myself, who's kind of been in this world for over 20 years at this point, and to see their reactions and their responses to some of the questions that you posed. I would have thought that even if the clinical trials had been, in the distant past, that they would have at least the knowledge of the basics of those clinical trials. And it didn't seem like they did. Were you surprised by that when giving those depositions?
I was surprised when I took Dr. Stanley Plotkin's deposition. I mean, when I took that deposition now 7 years ago, I knew a fraction of what I know now about vaccines. And I went into that deposition thinking there were going to be twists and turns. I thought, there was going to be stuff that will tell me, I'll be like, ooh, I didn't know that about this or that, or there's some repository of data, or, because, in many ways, a deposition that it happens before trial. And the purpose is for me to learn what evidence, what proof, what are the foundations for what the expert is going to be opining about. So if Dr. Stanley Plotkin was coming into this case to say that this completely unvaccinated kid over the mother's injection should get the whole CDC schedule. So obviously at issue is the whole CDC schedule, its safety, its efficacy, all of that. And you would think that, so yes, I was surprised, and I'll tell you one small story from it that really surprised me in retrospect, is that we started going through all the vaccines that he wanted. He was there to say this kid should get, who he had never met, he doesn't know, all right? And we started with the very first vaccine on the schedule, hepatitis B vaccine. And so I asked him about, there's only two standalone licensed Hep B vaccines, and I asked him about the first one, Recombavax HB. And I said, Dr. Plotkin, how long safety monitored for or safety reviewed for in the clinical trial relied upon to license vaccine? And I thought he would know the answer, and I thought he would tell me, oh, there's all this other data or whatever. And so, clearly he's not sure. So I hand him the package insert, because in section 6.1 is required by federal regs, it summarizes the clinical trial. And I said, all right, let's go to section 6.1. So he turns to it. He's like, oh, monitor for 5 days with 147 kids, and there's no control group listed. That's the whole clinical trial relied upon to license this product before it was unleashed on millions of kids. It's useless for determining safety because, first of all, there's no control group. So what are you comparing it against? And even if it was a control group, you only monitor safety for 5 days. And even if you monitor safety, even if it had a placebo control, and even if you monitor safety for years, it only had 147 kids. So this thing was utterly useless for safety. Ask any epidemiologist, or statistician. It's not a joke is too kind of a word. In any event, he seems surprised, Frank, about that. He seemed surprised. And after the deposition, I even subpoenaed him to give me any other data you have to support this licensure of this vaccine. Like, give me anything. Come on. All right. I subpoenaed him. Here's your opportunity. Give him a do-over after the deposition because it's pretty embarrassing because he had nothing in the depot. Instead of producing any additional information, he moved to quash the subpoena. Never produced anything. We still didn't stop. On behalf of ICANN, the Informed Consent Action Network, the nonprofit that funds a lot of the vaccine policy work that my firm does, we FOIA'd the FDA for the underlying clinical trial reports for that vaccine. And when we got them, guess who the principal investigator was for the clinical trial relied upon to license that very Hep B vaccine for children? Dr. Stanley Plotkin. And what that reflected to me when I saw that was that, and it's been reaffirmed over and over again, that safety is such an afterthought. It's just presumed that even the principal investigator of that trial, when asked in a deposition about the basic features of the trial, how long safety didn't even know them. I mean, you could see it from his face in that deposition. So I think that's a good window into this world of vaccinologists like Dr. Plotkin and so forth, and how they view and think about these products in terms of how they approach safety.
Yeah, so let's get into safety. But I think one of the questions that I never see asked by those who advocate for vaccines is whether or not a vaccine is even necessary. I know we've got so many vaccines coming in the pipeline in development. However, they're for like these very obscure illnesses that, most people will never encounter within their lifetime. Presumably, obviously, because of the lack of liability, right? So they market it as a vaccine, then they are free from liability if they get those protections. So, tell us a little bit about the necessity of various vaccines or some stories that might point to, questions regarding whether or not a vaccine is even necessary in the first place.
Well, they're very necessary for pharmaceutical companies to keep increasing their profitability. And what a great business model. They were a tiny percent of the portfolio back in 86, but now you've got a product where you don't have to worry about a market because they're mandated. You don't have to worry about injuries because they're immunity. You don't have to worry about marketing. Government does it for you. And so, I mean, you can't think of a better business model, right? But now putting that piece of it aside, to actually answer your question, yeah, you should go. You want to go vaccine by vaccine, and I'll use hepatitis B vaccine as an example. So in Denmark, there is no hepatitis B vaccine on the schedule. The vaccination rate for Hep B amongst the childhood population in Denmark is like 0.01%. It's basically zero. The only children that get Hep B vaccine in Denmark are kids born to Hep B positive mothers and certain very high risk groups. That's it. That's it. And the rate of chronic Hep B amongst children in Denmark versus the US, effectively the same. So there you go. You have a real world example, Denmark versus the US, one using the product, one not using the product. Then you could see the outcomes. I mean, in my mind, the critical question that one always needs to ask, and you don't see this typically almost ever out of the CDC or otherwise, is what is the number needed to vaccinate, the NNV, to prevent one case of serious harm versus what is the number of children harmed from the product? So, for example, for Hep B vaccine, for children born to non-Hep B positive mothers, based on the actual historical data of the Hep B amongst children before there was a vaccine, not this post facto estimate nonsense, actual reported cases, you would need to probably vaccinate north of 100,000 kids to prevent one case of chronic hepatitis B vaccine to a child born to a non-Hep B positive mother. So that's your NNV, okay? Well, now you got to ask, does the vaccine cause serious adverse events at more or less than 100, 1 in 100,000 kids. Okay. And I will tell you this, no baby has ever died of hepatitis B. Hepatitis B, okay, um, on the first day of life. But babies have died from the vaccine the first day of life. Um,
Right, but they're not looking at that data, right? Correct me if
oh,
I'm wrong, but they're not trying to figure out if these babies are being harmed by the Hep B vaccine,
oh, there's a
right?
baby that was compensated in the National Vaccine Injury So you can't sue the manufacturer, but you can bring a claim in this policy-driven program in the federal government if you're injured by a vaccine. And the bar and the threat and it's supposed to be easier to get compensation. It's not. You have to prove causation with your arms tied around behind your back, so you get no discovery, no depositions, or whatnot. And a baby was adjudicated to have died from a hepatitis B vaccine on the first day of life. So that's just one example. And that is really hard to get done because they virtually never comp dead babies on a policy basis. But in this instance, they just really, really couldn't avoid that conclusion. So yes, but you're right. They typically will not admit it, but in that instance, they did. That's just one example. There are other serious injuries that hepatitis B vaccines can cause. Because if you end up a chronic carrier of hepatitis B, that's not good, but the effects are going to be way down the road in your life. If you have a serious adverse reaction to a hepatitis B vaccine, the effects are immediate. The baby will die then and there, or will have a serious adverse event that will then last them their entire life. So, from if you asked me, based on my assessment of it, you are more likely to be injured from the vaccine than you are to end up being a chronic carrier of hepatitis B if you're born to a non-Hep B positive mother. So the even the risk benefit profile to me doesn't even make sense. And I think that's probably why Denmark never put it on their schedule, nor many other countries.
Right. And something that I've pointed out numerous times, particularly with the Hep B, is that essentially we're eliminating, with the exception of children that are completely unvaccinated, which is a relatively small number, probably more so now in the last few years. But ultimately, we're eliminating any kind of control group with regard to the subsequent vaccines, right? Because we're vaccinating on the first day of life, then we immediately are, changing that child's immunity potentially. And we don't really know the impact that that particular vaccine has had on future vaccines or otherwise, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on an important point, which is if you want to know the safety of the schedule, you've really got to compare exposed to unexposed. If you want to study asbestos, you don't like say, well, we'll compare these folks, this exposure with that exposure with that. No, you just compare people who were not exposed to are exposed, right? It's kind of elementary. And so according to the CDC, around 2% of kids, according to the most recent available data, it matters how you look at it. But around 2% of kids are completely unvaccinated by 2 years of age. That's 1 in 50 kids. It's actually not that's just a good number of kids out there. Based on my estimation, there's about 650,000 completely unvaccinated children in America today. 650,000. That's a lot of kids. And that is certainly sufficient to conduct studies comparing their health outcomes to the vaccinated kids' health outcomes. And there actually been a whole series of studies that have done that. Some of them are smaller, retrospective, or not, but they exist of different kinds. Some of them are based on surveys filled out by homeschoolers. Some of them are looking at comparing children within existing practices. Some of them use other methodologies, but they all come to effectively the same conclusion. They're consistent in the following regard, that the vaccinated kids often have multiple times the chronic health issues than the unvaccinated kids. And which chronic health issues do they have? The very chronic health issues that we've seen explode since the 1980s. The data reflect that in the early 1980s, under 10% of kids in America had a chronic health issue. Today, it's over 40 or 50%, often with multiple chronic health issues. Most of the chronic health issues that have exploded have their basis in some form of immune system dysregulation, whether it's asthma, whether it's even, you go down the list. And those very same conditions, these studies found that the vaccinated kids have multiple times the rate of as the unvaccinated children. So yeah, it is critically important to compare those groups. And then if you find an issue, which they've been finding over and over and over again, then you can drill down to your point, which vaccine, what timing, when and what. And this notion of doing this comparison is not like something like made up by those who take issue with vaccines. The Institute of Medicine, after being paid by HHS to review the safety of the child's schedule, said, we can't find any studies did this comparison. And so when they published their review in 2013, said you can do this comparison using something called the Vaccine Safety Data Link, which is a CDC database that probably has about 20,000 unvaccinated kids in it. The CDC then spent hundreds of thousands of dollars paying people in a report which included authors like Stanley Plotkin, by the way, on how to do this comparison. They could have given me $1. I could have told them it's pretty simple. Okay. Just just take kids, track them from birth onwards, longitudinal data, and compare all ICD-9, 10 codes to the billing codes between the kids that got 0 vaccines and kids that got 1 or more, and just see what's the differential in neurodevelopmental disorders, autoimmune disorders. It's not complicated to do this stuff. Anyways, they spent hundreds of thousands. They published a white paper on how to do this study, okay, in 2015. So it's now been a decade. You think they haven't done it, or you think you haven't published it?
Oh, it's definitely been done. They certainly have not published it. And the argument, by the way, for those of you who are new to this conversation, is consistently that they can't do the study because it would be unethical to
Yeah.
not vaccinate children against these deadly diseases. So,
Right. Well, that argument is applies when you're doing a prospective study, when
right.
you're starting on day one, like a clinical trial, and then you're making a choice whether to expose or not expose to the product. These studies use existing data, right? They're retrospective. There's nothing unethical. They don't even argue that's unethical to do, by the way. They,
Mm.
they, that's not their reasoning for not publishing this study. If they wanted to shut up everybody who claims vaccines that cause harms, don't you think they would have published the study ages ago? I mean, it seems to me, unlikely that they haven't done this comparison. It seems more likely that they have, but they just can't get the results to show what they want. And so they don't publish it, though I can't prove that.
So that brings us around to this whole safety argument of the safe and effective mantra. So, when those arguing in favor of vaccines state that a vaccine is unequivocally safe, and by vaccines, they mean the whole host of vaccines typically. They don't typically, select a few from that particular menu of options. So, tell us a little bit about some of that quote unquote safety data and why it might be a little bit different than what most people are led to believe.
Start with this. If vaccines are so safe, why do they need immunity for the harms they won't cause? Why? If they're so safe, why do they need that immunity? And maybe, okay, so, and maybe you wanted to give them immunity to, like at the beginning or whatever, but now for like the Hep B vaccines, it's been 40 years. You still don't know they're safe? You still can't lift the immunity? Why? Clearly, there's a problem. Second point is this. Um, there is a window into the what even the manufacturers believe these products kind of harms they can cause. Because under federal regulations, um, a pharmaceutical company is supposed to list on the package insert in section 6.2. So the 6.1 was the clinical trial data. We talked about that earlier. 6.2 is the post-licensure after it gets to the market. What injuries have been found? And the regulation provides that the manufacturer, the pharma, is only supposed to list those adverse events for which it has a basis to believe are causally related to the product. Not my words, that's federal law. And so only those that have some basis to be causally related should be listed. And if you pull up the package insert, go to section 6.2, you will find a whole host of quite concerning, and I'm softening it, harms that these products, as disclosed by the manufacturers, they have a basis to believe can cause. And these very same harms, many of them are neurological or immune-mediated neurological disorders, are also the ones we, as a law firm, get calls for. They're the ones you'll see claims for in the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, which has paid out about $5 billion to date for injuries with a cap of $250,000 for death and for pain and suffering, in a program where, like I said earlier, the lawyers like my firm have their hands tied behind their back because they can't get discovery, they can't do depositions where they normally you would prove causation in an area where most doctors don't even want to touch it. Um, and so you've got that you've got the companies themselves telling you the harms. They're not putting it on there for fun, like, oh yeah, transverse myelitis, Guillain-Barré syndrome. They're not just listing it there for fun. And then separately, you have the list of studies that we didn't go through the studies, but the studies that look at kids who have been exposed to unexposed, which is where you should start this question. And the findings are really, really concerning. So, I mean, I could go down the rabbit hole on safety, but I think that just from a super high 20,000 foot level, that gives you kind of a lay of the land.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I do think, in recent years, we've had a lot of new people obviously come into this conversation. Back when I wasn't vaccinating and home birthing and all of those things almost 20 years ago, that was like you were a total pariah, kicked out of every mommy and me group and all of those things. So, but I do think that this has become much more mainstream. Obviously, we have Secretary Kennedy in office, and now President Trump coming out, and reducing the CDC schedule. All of these things are fantastic, but it is normalizing the conversation in a way that certainly I didn't think I would see in my lifetime. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's cultural cognition around these products is changing. I mean, um, pre-COVID, just saying a vaccine caused injury, what are you talking about? Like, it wasn't even part of the cultural cognition, this idea that vaccines can cause injury. What CNN and MSNBC and New York Times did a great job at is they kept saying vaccines don't cause injury. But people hear is they cause injury. So they keep saying it over and over again. And they made it into a question. They made it a question amongst the masses. By trying to say it's not a question, they made it a question in many ways. And obviously, the American public got a front row seat to the rollout of a vaccine. You know, before COVID, when I would talk about placebo controls or clinical trials, it was like, you know, the basics of clinical trials even became part of national conversation. And so, to your point, yes, I think that discussing the trials relied upon, the post-licensure safety, does it make sense? Does this vaccine make sense? Is part now, I think, of the national conversation. I think and I think it will only increase with time. And again, as more people start thinking of these as products rather than things they have to believe in, they start thinking rather than believing, the closer we are to real lasting change in this. And I guess I should, to your last question about safety, on chapter 11 of my book, I go through a lot of that. So that's another place, by the way, you could, if that will put meat on the bones of my very skeletal answer.
Absolutely. And I think everybody listening, if you are new to the conversation, even if you are not new to the conversation, definitely check out the book Vaccines Amen by Erin Siri. Um, you made another comment earlier that I wanted to circle back to, and that is the Institute of Medicine. So I actually did not realize that they were an independent agency. And so I want to make sure and reiterate that this is not some sort of like high and mighty. Well, I mean, I suppose it is from an institutional standpoint, but this is an agency that is. Uh, well, I'll let you tell the
Yeah, it's not an agency actually at all. It's a private organization. Now,
right.
it was created initially as a creature of Congress by statute, but it's a totally private organization. And most of the reports are done for government, and a lot of the reports are for government and for industry, who pay them to do the reports. So, they're viewed as some kind of like, you know, independent body, but they're really not. They're as far from independent as they're paid for their reports, and they have repeat customers that keep coming back, and they certainly want to please them. I just read a book called by Gavin DeBecker,
Yeah, forbidden facts. Yeah.
Forbidden Facts,
Yeah.
and who I thought did a nice, very nice job, a good job of going through the Institute of Medicine proceedings for a whole bunch of issues that were the result of government policies, and how the Institute of Medicine really plays cover up for the government. Because what's the government going to do? They're the ones who used Agent Orange. They're the ones who did use a whole bunch of different products and chemicals that caused harm. Now they're not going to validate their own safety, so they go out and they pay the IOM, now known as the National Academy of Medicine, to basically cover up for them.
Yeah, amazing. I read that book as well, and it was brilliantly laid out and hysterical, actually. All right, so we have reached the end of our episode. I ask every single one of our guests these 8 rapid fire questions. So you are in the hot seat, Mr. Siri. Are you ready?
Sure.
All right, number one, if you could choose only one natural remedy for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Sunlight.
Nice. All right, number two, tell us something most people don't know about you.
Um, um, given the coverage of many people, uh, I, that I went to Berkeley for law school, people don't assume that usually.
All right, number three, if I were to compile a playlist of happy music, what song would you suggest be added?
Oh, you should listen to my kids listen to. It's all very happy. I like all the new stuff they listen to.
Nice. All right, number four, what is your favorite guilty pleasure?
Uh, Dark chocolate.
Nice. All right, number five, what is the most influential book you've ever read?
Oof. I did go through a period where I read a lot of religious texts of different religions, I thought, and you know, uh, none of them I found to be really fascinating. It gives you a window into um, a lot of things. I found that Tibetan Book of Living and Dying to be a very fascinating book. One of the few books I think I've read twice. Obviously read the Old Testament all the time as well. Um,
Awesome. All right, what does the word revolution mean to you?
Revolution. Um, well, I would say in America today, revolution, as it stands right now, is um, standing up for just our basic civil individual rights. The massive corporate interests, lobbying interests, and other organizations have become so big, so powerful, so moneyed, that they can have an impact and an effect on our rights in a way I think was unthinkable, you know, uh, when this country was founded. And I think that maybe one of the greatest threats we face today is by interests whereby taking away your individual and civil rights, whether it's freedom of speech, whether it's informed consent, go down the list, whether it's practice your religion, when that abuts with their financial interests, um, they will they work to, to cabin, limit, reduce your rights. I mean, I'll just let's look at this just past week alone. I mean, you heard about this pesticide bill that they
Hmm.
wanted to give immunity to the pesticide industry like they did for vaccines effectively. I mean, what a nightmare that would have been. Whose interest is that for? The American public? Your rights? Your kids' rights? Of course not. And what it does is it destroys a whole host of various rights down chain. So, anyways, that's not rapid fire, but they got my answer.
All right. What does the word remedy mean to you?
Remedy to me means something that actually treats the root cause of an issue. It's not treating the symptoms. It's not addressing the surface results. It's actually going to the root cause of the issue and addressing it, right? It's not just, so a remedy for the issues of vaccines are repeal the 1986 Act, bring back the, get rid of
Amen.
the mandates, right? I mean, that's remedy. Let the companies sell as many vaccines as they want. Everybody should be free to get as many vaccines as they want. It's America. That's freedom. Support everybody's right to do it. But nobody should be coerced to do it. Nobody.
I agree wholeheartedly. All right. And lastly, if you could impart one piece of wisdom onto our listeners, what would that be?
Well, I just given the topic that we're talking about, I'll stick with that theme, right? Because there's that question. Wow, there's a lot of answers to that one. But uh, I would say this for anybody who's watching this, who's has questions about, well, maybe some vaccines should be mandated, or we should give the right to mandate this or that product. The problem is that once you see that right, once you say you can't go to school without getting X medical product, you can't get a job, you can't participate in civil society, there is no hard line. That line is a line in the sand, and it will constantly be moved by interests and corporate interests that are far more powerful and greater. We happen to have a president right now and a secretary at Health HHS and an awakening amongst certain states right now post-COVID. But that's going to dissipate over time. And if we don't wake up today and decide that no, this is a red line, the red line is persuade us as much as you want. Heck, spend billions of our own dollars to try to persuade us to take a product. But if you can't persuade us on the merits, that's where it has to end. And you should never take away someone's right to go to school, get a job, participate in civil society on the basis of getting a medical product, because your body and your kid's body are the commodity, so to speak, on which pharma is to make their profits. The more they can get you to inject, ingest, and put on your body, the more money they can make. And the quickest route to that is taking away your rights. Takes far less money to get a law passed than it does to do a $100 million advertising campaign to persuade you to take it. And so that has to be a red line. It wasn't as big of a deal even a decade ago. It is becoming an increasing problem because industry has realized this is, I think, the quickest route to money. And you saw what they tried to do in COVID. And if you don't hold the line, so my point is this: even if you love every vaccine and you love every mask mandate and you love masks and you love staying at home in your basement forever in your own self-imposed stay-at-home order, great, do all of that. But if you permit the government to force you to do it, to coerce you to do it, if the day comes where there's a product you don't want, then what are you going to do? Because the rights ceded are rarely returned.
Yeah, absolutely. No more cheeseburgers and Wheel of Fortune games and all of that, right? All right. Thank you so much, Erin, Siri. It has been a pleasure. Where can people find Vaccines Amen, and where can they learn more about the work that you're doing?
Sure. The book's available on Amazon, and my law firm is SiriLLP.com. We have about, over 100 folks at the firm, and around 50 of them do vaccine-related work of every single kind, whether it's exemptions or injury or, you name it. And then ErinSiriOfficial.com is where I have like all the social media stuff. Like I'm on Twitter and so forth. And then for the vaccine policy work that we do, including some of the lawsuits, we haven't talked about many of them, but a lot of the lawsuits that we do around protecting individual and civil rights, those are supported by a nonprofit called the Informed Consent Action Network, ICANDecide.org, and they're a great organization. I highly recommend supporting them.
Absolutely. And watch the high wire. You see Erin Siri on there sometimes. All right, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you, Erin Siri. It has been my pleasure. We'll see you all next time. Take care.
Thank you.
With hope as a guiding light, through darkest days we'll fight the night. With a whole lot of passion, with a whole lot of truth, Remedy Revolution is here for you.